Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah. Welcome to the panel, Does Humanitarian Aid Prolong War? I'm very happy to be here again. Some already saw me on a different panel, but as a contributor, not as a moderator. So forgive me for you have to deal with my face again. And let me introduce my panelists. First of all, Bertrand Taithe. He's a professor at University of Manchester. Then to my right, to your left, it's Suzanna Tkalec. She's a humanitarian director and member of the senior management team of Caritas International. Then next to her is Günther Barnet. He works for the Ministry of Defense. And on the other side, Sabine Kampmüller. She is a director of evaluation with Médecins Sans Frontières. And she sits in for José Antonio Bastos, who could not come. Thanks a lot for making yourself available. And I think we jump right in as we are running a little bit late. And already let me ask quickly Bertrand to go ahead with his presentation.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be in such an august building and to have Maria Teresa pointing out to us that we should keep time and be effective. So, does humanitarian aid prolong war? Well, I'm by training a historian, and I direct an Institute of Humanitarian Studies. So my interest here is to try to bring a little bit of distance on the topic and maybe a bit of critical distance on these issues, because we have a tendency in the humanitarian sector, and I say we because I've been part of the broader companionship of the humanitarian sector for 15 years or so. We have a tendency to imagine that all the problems of today are set in the present tense, that nothing is actually common with the past, that everything is actually worse than it used to be, that money is greater than it used to be, etc., etc. And there's some truth in it, but there's also a lot of errors. And I think we can go back a little bit to ask ourselves whether some of our questions are well posed. So first of all, let me query the question. How could humanitarian aid prolong war? And in the same sense that the symptomatic treatment of an illness is not causal to an illness, that actually treating a patient does not prolong sickness. It might amount to a form of medical stubbornness, perhaps a form of cruelty, but it would never be framed in those terms. It's not merely an ethical question, it's a political question, and a historical question as well. In fact, the first time that somebody asked whether humanitarian aid was prolonging war was in 1870, 145 years ago. So 145 years ago, people asked themselves, does the Geneva Convention and humanitarian aid, which was then mostly the Red Cross movement, prolong war? And they had a very good argument in the sense that the humanitarian subject at that time were soldiers. The main object of care of the international community was the relief of soldiers, the sick and wounded of the armies and navies. But of course, since then, we've included all sorts of people into the humanitarian international law. We've actually expanded dramatically. We've expanded dramatically to civilians, we've expanded dramatically to children, and to a range of other situations than the conventional warfare that Henri Dunant imagined at the time. But we also invented total war, and we invented different forms of war. And these different forms of war actually look at civilians not as innocent victims, but as tactical or strategic assets. So I don't actually like the question because on the one hand it's a very old question, and secondly because it's an impossible one to answer very straightforwardly. So I'm suggesting 4 questions instead, which I want to address very briefly. Does humanitarian aid contribute to a war economy? Does humanitarian aid contribute to war effort? Can humanitarian aid give legitimacy to war? And finally, can war ever be humanitarian? Okay, these are my 4 questions. So I'm going to be very quick. So does humanitarian aid contribute to a war economy? Well, there are many examples of that. And how did that happen? Usually, it is because humanitarians face insecure situations, and because they are in insecure situations, they have to rely on the armed people to provide a degree of security. Now, where do you find weaponized guards in a difficult situation, except amongst the combatants themselves? And that has happened in the past, most famously, for example, in Somalia, where warlords provided, in the early 1990s, a lot of the ground force that was helping the humanitarians to stay alive. So, protection racket can contribute to a war economy. In the same way that, and this is perhaps a recent trend, but in the last 20-odd years, the growth of kidnapping as a form of parasitic activity born out of war. It's not necessarily linked to war, because it could be criminal kidnapping, or indeed it can be criminal kidnapping in war situations. However, the payment of ransoms, which occasionally occurs, may lead to a situation where humanitarian aid contributes unwittingly to a war economy. Does humanitarian aid contribute to a war effort? And that implies that humanitarians are occasionally instrumentalized by warring parties, or indeed self-instrumentalized. I will give you a classic case, and this is one of the most famous ones because, well, famous, I'm not sure it is that well known, but for example, at the fall of the Khmer Rouge, the genocidal government of Cambodia, the camps were set up on the borders of Thailand. Those camps were literally military camps for the Cambodian Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge were reliant on these camps. These camps were fed by the international community. They were fed largely by the UN effort, but also the humanitarian agencies were part and party of this effort to maintain these people alive. These people were hostages of the official government of Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge retained their seat in the UN until 1992. Now, during that particular period, undoubtedly, humanitarian aid was used by the Khmer Rouge to sustain a war effort. Without that humanitarian aid, they would never have been staying quite so long as a fighting force on the border of Thailand. It's very shocking on the one hand, and people knew it in the UN system. But what was the alternative? Let's ask ourselves that question. Forced repatriation in a war zone, in a mined territory, massacres, resettlement, and in fact, we were then more generous. I'm referring to the previous panel in this room. We were much more generous with resettlement in the 1980s than we currently are. Hundreds of thousands of people from Indochina were resettled in America and in Europe on a scale that is almost impossible to imagine today. What could you do in that particular situation? Was it legitimate to be instrumentalized in this fashion? The question recurred again in Rwanda, protecting people amongst whom perpetrators were hiding. Is that being instrumentalized? Is that being part of a war effort? Is there an alternative that is humane to those innocent victims, those children, those women, who are not perpetrators, but who might be shielding the perpetrators unwittingly? Can humanitarian aid give legitimacy to war? And there is an anxiety here because we've got much more recent examples. When President Obama, last month I think, reiterated the same speech as Colin Powell after 9/11, which is essentially that humanitarian aid funded by American taxpayers should actually follow the diplomatic and foreign affairs imperatives of the United States. Very blunt statement, very brutal statement, very logical statement from a political point of view. He's openly saying that what many always suspected, and when you look at the financing of the largest NGOs in the world, which with very few exceptions, such as MSF, which is largely privately funded, well, actually overwhelmingly privately funded, most NGOs rely a lot on large institutional donors. Those large institutional donors are states, such as USAID, such as DFID in the United Kingdom, HuCo in Europe, etc., etc. Can humanitarians not appear to be the instrument of foreign policy, or indeed give some legitimacy to a war or indeed an occupation? And I think this is partly the problem here, is that humanitarians have a duty of care. They have a duty to deliver humanitarian aid. But in some contexts, the military may feel tempted to instrumentalize that aid to actually present themselves in a favorable light to an occupied nation. Afghanistan is one example where on many occurrences, documented occurrences, the military actually used humanitarian aid as a sweetener for their presence in the country, a kind of heart and minds campaign. How do you handle that particular question? The final question is, can war be humanitarian? And this is quite provocative. In fact, the first time I've encountered that formulation, I am waging a humanitarian war, is in 1900 in a devastated village in Africa where a French officer by the name of Voulet, having massacred the entire population of the town. This is almost impossible to imagine. This man had massacred an entire village, in fact, a small town. And in his tent, with the bodies unburied next to his tent. We know that the bodies weren't buried because it's documented. The people came afterwards, found the bodies. He wrote a letter, and I've seen the letter with my own eyes. And in that letter he said, I am waging a humanitarian war. And his rationale was, my war is brutal, so brutal that it will end wars. So my kind of war is a humanitarian war. That's an extreme. In fact, while you could argue that many people followed this kind of inhumane realpolitik approach to warfare, they didn't use the word humanitarian in that very free way that this French officer used in 1900. But at the other end of the spectrum, we've attempted endlessly to make war more humane. And what do we mean by that? We signed conventions against forbidden weapons. The first one was in 1868, exploding bullets. One of the most recent ones was about ecological warfare, gases, shelling from above, before we had airplanes. Basically, all the things we've used have been barred, usually before they were used. So there's an interesting correlation here between our attempt to make war more humane, to make war possible, yet less devastating, and the reality, which almost invariably violated our own regulations. But often in an unpredictable manner, because I was reminding my students that everybody before the Second World War was given a gas mask, but gases weren't used in war, not in the Second World War. They were used for the extermination of the Jews, but not for the bombing of the civilian populations. So force is to recognize, when we gaze back over the last 150 years, that in the same manner that humanitarianism has become part of the modern condition, so has inhumane warfare. In fact, there is a troubling relationship between our effort to become humanitarian and the brutality of warfare. So I guess I've not left an awful lot of room for rampant optimism. But in my statement, placing both war and humanitarian aid in a difficult but fractious relationship, one does not compensate for the other. Humanitarians are endlessly, I say endlessly because I've been in a couple of conferences recently where humanitarians are saying, we've never spent so much money on humanitarian aid, 22 billion, that's the highest figure I've heard, slightly less today, but in fact I think it's closer to 22 billion pounds, $22 billion have been spent on humanitarian aid. $22 billion, that's 1/3 of Airbus revenue in 2014, okay? It's about the same as the yogurt industry, or a bit less than the yogurt industry worldwide. So it isn't a large amount by any stretch of the imagination. We're not talking about anything comparable with the weapon industry, okay? I mean, if you look at the contract for the Rafale planes that the French were signing with Egypt, for 18 planes, we're talking 5 billion. So, I mean, we're really not comparing like with like. Humanitarian aid will never compensate for the vast amount of ingenuity and money we spend on the military effort. When we spent the most money on humanitarian aid was at the end of the Second World War, and that represented 5 days' worth of the military effort, okay? So let's put things into perspective. So should we stop humanitarian aid then? Is it futile? Well, I think there's an element of futility in humanitarian aid, something admirable about the quixotic nature. We're a bit like Don Quixote, fighting giants. But I think that's what makes humanitarian aid so worthwhile, because alone it can restore our humanity in the face of naked evil. Thank you very much.
Bertrand, thanks a lot. I hope you in the audience have time until 10 o'clock at night, because you raised so many issues here in your talk that if we really want to go through all of them, I think we would sit here until 10 o'clock. Unfortunately, we have only until 5, so I really have to just focus on some of the issues. And you said a lot of things and a lot of them we should actually discuss. What about humanitarian intervention? That was, I think, a very complex issue that you brought up. Then, what about the humanitarian aid that actually helps the war effort, in the sense that refugee camps provide maybe recruiting grounds and all these issues that we know? Or, for instance, that there is, you said, for instance, kidnapping records where basic humanitarian organizations need to pay off certain criminal organizations that maybe go as rebels or whatever the hat they're wearing. And of course, you have sometimes to pay to actually be operational in the country, so maybe fees, maybe something else. Let's start off with asking the representative of MSF, because you're working in very difficult war zones, sometimes, let's say, with invisible operations, even where only maybe journalists on the ground know that that's actually MSF operational here, but in fact it's not as such because it's too dangerous sometimes. Sometimes you actually work on two sides of a conflict, where varying parties, and you provide humanitarian services to both sides. So basically all what Bertrand says, I'm sure, is in Paris. You go through all these debates on a constant basis. So pick and choose whatever the issues you want to tackle first, and then we go deeper into the subjects.
Yeah, I think I'll start with what I consider the simplest aspect of how you've broken down the question, which is, can war ever be humanitarian? And the answer is simple: no, it can't. And I mean, what we are as MSF rejecting is the label humanitarian. Yeah. Of course, a military intervention can be for a good reason, and even ourselves, even MSF has called for at very rare occasions for a military intervention, for example, to stop the genocide when we saw it starting in Rwanda. So it may be for good moral reasons, but please let's not label it humanitarian. For us, it's so essential that humanitarianism is associated with the key principles, and a number of the speakers before us have referred to that, have referred to neutrality, independence, and impartiality. And let's be clear, a military intervention will always have a political mandate, and it has to be, and that's neither good nor bad, but it can never be independent. So for us, it's critically important to save those principles for how we really understand the meaning of the word humanitarianism. And the other aspect to this is that humanitarian action essentially aims to minimize the harm caused by war. So let's not confuse all of this. Other aspects, I mean, of course, the overall question is valid, and we have to debate it, and I'm grateful for the occasion to rethink it, because that's what we constantly have to do. The aspect of feeding into war economy, there are many examples of concern. We know that goods are diverted, resources are looted. We know that in some places we have to pay taxes that often end up with rebel fractions. So there is a real issue there. MSF has recently looked into it on the examples of Chad and Darfur to actually estimate the amount of looted goods. And what we saw was that this amounted to about 4% in Chad and 8% of the total budget there. So still we could say that more than 90% of our deployment there has actually reached people. And that's very reassuring. Still, we are concerned that cars have been taken by rebel fractions, communication items have been used, and we truly want to avoid that. And I can say very practically, because I want to come to a positive note on this, we are learning. And on these two examples, our teams have started to use more inattractive goods, using more tankers for transport or local vehicles, using different communication tools to make us less of an attractive target. Still, it remains a struggle. On the issue of legitimacy, giving legitimacy to warfare, MSF certainly is in a very privileged position, being funded by private donors, and that really ensures an independence that I know is much more difficult for colleagues and organizations funded by institutional donors. For us, the question of legitimacy comes in more when we are negotiating with all the warring parties, because of course we may give legitimacy just by working with them and working through them, but again, what would be the alternative? And there is no alternative. Becoming part of the war effort, I think our most difficult experience on this was in Ethiopia in the 80s. Yeah. And it's a bit similar to the example that you, Bertrand, brought, where in Ethiopia the government actually talked about starvation. There was real starvation, but it was very much actually caused by the government and their desire to resettle the population. So we had to discover that the camps where people were supposed to be fed actually were very much instrumentalized. And MSF spoke out about this when we realized that we couldn't, that about 6,000 children died. We had the means to save them, to feed them, but we weren't allowed to access them. And after speaking out, MSF was expelled from Ethiopia. So again, I think what we've learned is that being alert and being very rigorous in the analysis that we do on the context is critically important. And my last point is that it all comes down to the question on how we do humanitarian aid. I think there's no question that there is a need, and we are there to cover essential needs that are not covered by governments in war, but it is about how we do this. And I believe many of the humanitarian agencies were inspired by the work of Mary B. Anderson in the 90s and her do no harm principles. And it's interesting that this really comes from medical ethics, where do no harm always is the first rule. So this approach really has also taught us on what to look at in terms of a good understanding of what are the dividers and what are the enablers of stability and peace. And if we have time, there are more examples on how this could look like in practice. I'm just thinking of one of our hospitals in Congo that we ended up putting at the front line so that the different warring parties could actually have access. And it meant that it was only pertinent there for a few years, as long as the conflict lasted. But I truly believe it was one of the examples where health provision became a meeting point for the divided parties. And yeah, I think that's the way to learn and the way to go.
But isn't that exactly also what you just mentioned, this hospital, for instance, exactly the thing that we're talking about here? Because the moment you provide medical services for all competence, non-competence, of course, as soon as they land in the hospital, they're humans. We don't look whether uniform and so on, right? So the question is, doesn't that still boost morale for the troops actually killing each other or trying to kill each other? So you're kind of, what can you do? Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
You see, the image always is that healthcare in war is about treating the wounded. It's not. It's about the health system that have collapsed, the kids that have no access to vaccination, women who are delivering somewhere under difficult circumstances. That's the big portion of the assistance that we are supposed to deliver. And really the care for the wounded is a minor aspect.
Yeah. But still, as I think some of the organizers, I haven't chosen the topic, the organizers have, obviously to get out of this panel a lively debate. So still insist, but still, that's the core of the problem that we're discussing here. Does humanitarian aid prolong war? Is that yes, of course, there is a hospital that serves combatants. Maybe the armies would be able to provide it. Would I fight as bravely if I knew that even a little shot through the arm will kill me? Maybe not. I'm not sure. I mean, that's what we should. What's here on the table here, right?
Yeah. That's the Quaker argument.
Yeah. I'm not a Quaker.
It's a pacifist argument, which aims to the abolition of war. So it depends if you're an idealist or a realist. If you're an idealist, you think that you can end war by making war unbearable. I think your French officer that you mentioned, but I think
kill everyone.
But I think evidence is against you on that, you know. And the other one is to take a patient-based approach, which is one life is worth saving because that's incommensurable. You cannot compare that.
Thank you, Sabine. And Suzanna.
May I just react on this? Because actually, you're very provocative, but I think that you have found a panel that is going to fight you back as much as we can, at least. What would be the alternative? I mean, it's very interesting because we keep talking, you know, about does humanitarian aid prolong war? Is it fueling conflicts? What are the alternatives and everything? But so I remember when I was still a student, there was the newly instituted, what was he, within the Council of Europe, a humanitarian commissioner for human rights and everything. And so I was a student, like the majority of the public here, and he came full of idealism and everything. He came straight from Chechnya. And one of the things he was talking about his experience, this was his first mission in this newly founded position that we were all looking like he's going to save human rights and protect and make sure, you know, that all of us, all our basic human rights are fully respected. The thing that he said was, you know, I came back and I was just thinking now, we should close the borders, let them fight, make it, you know, run its natural course. Whoever is the last standing, we will negotiate with them peace and then rebuild a new peaceful society. And I was there like, oh, is this what I'm supposed to be doing? And I said, no, absolutely no. As humanitarians, and I cannot agree more with what my colleague from MSF was saying, the way that we set up our operations there are really looking at preserving the civilian population. The moment that a soldier is wounded or has laid down arms, etc., we have the Geneva Convention and all the humanitarian law that says, yes, is he, you know, a civilian now? Is he still a soldier taking active part to conflicts and everything? No, he has the right to be treated. I mean, is this triggering? Is this making him go back? Maybe. But there it is really not to be so judgmental. We have to use our best due diligence. We definitely today, and I'm entering into my presentation already, I think that in 2015, and we have heard, 150 years of history of humanitarian action, do we have an ideal humanitarian response? Can we say, wow, this has been fantastic. I mean, we have all proven that we can save life at the same time restore peace and conflict? I don't think so. But what I can say is that I think as a humanitarian sector, and particularly looking both at NGO, and I have to say also some of the UN agencies as well, we have learned something from our past mistakes. We have learned from Cambodia, we have learned from Sudan, we have learned from Somalia, we have learned from Rwanda. But today we have put also, as NGOs, and as the humanitarian sector, so many self-regulating rules that when we are in the field, and so myself, leading an emergency response, I have to be sure that, we do fulfill that our action do not cause harm. It's something that we learn as well. It's experience post-Rwanda, post-Balkans at the time, Mary Anderson, etc. So I'm not sure if chronologically I'm putting in the right place. We are thinking about, we have SPHERE, we have the Code of Conduct of the ICRC and the NGOs, we have today the core humanitarian standards, everything which is trying to help us, in the reflection process in terms of how can we make sure that actually the assistance that we're putting in place as humanitarians reach the people that are most in need by providing them basic life-saving services, because when you think about humanitarian, okay, let's stick, to the first and the most critical phase of our intervention. The first thing that we need to do, and this is our moral responsibility, is saving lives. We are there to make sure, that the worst effects of a conflict is lessened. We are there also to assure that actually, at the end of the day, really, we save the people that are there in all the ways. I mean, MSF has a very specific mandate. They work on health. And obviously, as you know, clinics, particularly field clinics, and they will always be, subject of looting, medicines, etc. And then we have also, unfortunately, worst example where actually patients that are treated in those clinics can be also killed and take hostage, etc., etc. But think also about the other humanitarian assistance that we are providing. So it's like by now we know that we need to incorporate what we call the protection or mainstream protection in the way that we distribute assistance. So by now we know that we cannot, that the distribution point cannot be too close to the enemy lines, that people have to be put in a situation that when humanitarian assistance is delivered and distributed, that we lessen, the risk of them becoming targets of attacks, that in large gathering military camps and then forcibly enroll men and boys for their specific military actions, etc. So I think, we do know that first, we are not perfect, but I think that also at the same time, we are trying to be very good. And donors, sorry, I'm touching also on something that you were saying, we are the longa manus of foreign politics, etc. Donors as well, they are increasingly more demanding in terms of keeping us accountable and making sure that we can show where the money is going, that we have used our due diligence and all the best precautions in making sure that the money that we have received is actually not going into anti-terrorist groups. So you know that starting, I think, from 9/11, and I can tell you, whoever has been, receiving U.S. government funds, you are there every time to make anti-terrorist checks on every vendor that is coming. It takes you days or something, and as a humanitarian, you want to be able to quickly distribute, but we do have to do it. There is now an extensive also requirements, particularly looking at Syria, because as you know, it's difficult to track, particularly in the first days, with all the cross-border operations that were needed because the Syrian government was not allowing humanitarian assistance to come at the scale that was needed. We have been finding ourselves, we are in a situation that, can I guarantee 100% that this is going just to civilians, or might be that, a part goes somewhere else. But we have been, particularly in the last few years, we have been kept more and more, are receiving more demands to show that actually 100% of what we are using goes to help civilian population. It's not used for other purposes as well. It is a very complicated world, but I would say, end of the day, you still claim that, the humanitarian assistance, or this little that we receive compared to what are the economies of the world, is what makes a conflict go on?
No, okay. That's not what I was arguing. But can I query you on this? Because, now I wasn't arguing that at all. I'm saying that there are some occasional elements of confirmation. And I've used the word unwitting a lot, which is unwitting meaning, that there is no necessarily a desire to be instrumentalized, but an instrumentalization may happen. Now, it's interesting that, you've learned, the humanitarian sector has learned its lesson from the 80s and the Cold War. There's no doubt about that. But has it learned its lesson from Iraq and Afghanistan, where perhaps it was instrumentalized in a rather more subtle way in the state rebuilding effort? And I think there is evidence that perhaps at that stage, people went a little bit too far in what was perhaps a very utopian, generous idea, but which ultimately associated too closely the humanitarians with what was essentially a military stroke political operation.
I know from our debate that we had before sitting here that Günther wants to respond to that for sure, because that is one of the issues that is there. How can NGOs and humanitarians cooperate with armies for so-called, humanitarian assistance in these areas, and when is it civil-military cooperation? And you just raised the point that is maybe in some areas that these two parties became a little bit too close for comfort, humanitarians and people in uniform.
I'm not sure if I want to answer the question. As a soldier, I always say I have to. This is what the people think we should do. We wait until we're asked to do something, and then we do it. The way we do it is not so popular most of the time, but the way we do it is what most of the time the politicians and diplomats await from us, even if it's not very human. Let me first say that as I'm here on behalf of the Austrian Ministry of Defense, I try not only to speak on behalf of the Austrian Ministry of Defense, otherwise it would be quite boring for you what my answers would be. I try to say also what I personally think, and what I personally think is what most of the military officers in the so-called Western armies would think on these cases. So please, sorry for that in the beginning to say that. And secondly, to the professor, as an officer, I'm always an idealist and a realist. Otherwise, I would have to kill myself. Being a soldier without being both is for me impossible. Coming to the questions, does humanitarian aid prolong war? Yes, it can. Is this a problem? Generally not, particularly yes. Why generally not? It's their mandate. Their mandate is to help people who are suffering, who have harm, and it's the mandate of the humanitarian assistance, aid workers, however you want to call it, or the communities, to help these people. Do we as a military have a problem with that? Generally not, because you have your mandate, you follow your mandate, we have our mandate, we follow our mandate. Sometimes these two mandates, even if they are written by the same international community, are in rivalry. Is this a problem in particular? Yes. How can we work around that? Just find principles under which we work together, even if we don't like or even if we don't want, because it's just a necessity. As the professor already mentioned, the modern war has changed completely between what we have thought in the 19th century about it. Maybe some theorists in the 19th century also thought about something you would nowadays call a hybrid or a total war or whatever. But coming back to the times in the 20th century where we had conventional wars in the beginning, but even by the Second World War, you already said what it have seen how it harmed most of the time more civilians, and it's changing. All the wars are changing. It's even more harming the civilians than before and less the soldiers. We know that our best. So, but as the modern war is like that, there is just a necessity to work together. And the question is, how should this interaction be? Should it be very close or not? For me, it depends on the circumstances around it. Sometimes it is possible and necessary to work closely together. Sometimes it's better to not. But what we always should do is, and this is something we try to discuss in Austria, is to find specific principles for how to engage each other in different situations, and even discuss these principles out before we are going to work. So what we do in the army, for example, is training our soldiers on what could these principles look in different situations so they know how to change it at that specific moment and follow principles that have become, how to say, something like golden rules, how to work together. Is this difficult for the soldiers? Yes. Why? Just think about a non-commissioned officer, someone who has not an university studies done, who has been, how to say, before maybe a craftsman or something like that in his early 20s, staying in a country 3,000 to 4,000 kilometers away from home, not knowing the cultural context, things like that. And he has to follow his orders, and then he's the commander at the checkpoint, and a civilian car is driving next to his point, and he knows that from history that maybe those who he sees as the enemy, which which are most of the time insurgents and not classical armies, used civilian assets to camouflage their action. So should he shoot or not, and things like that. So it's very difficult questions on very, very basic levels, which you cannot, in this moment, discuss, scientifically and then give the answer. You must know how to act. So this is, of course, one of the problems I see. The other problems the military has, if only the humanitarian side thinks they have the moral on their side, we think we have also moral, and it's moral that the international community has given us within our mandates. What has changed for us? Changed for us is also that there's the discussion especially in the last 2 decades, that humanitarian aid is more under fire since there is a close cooperation with the military, and before it was better and the humanitarian space was better. I personally do not believe in that. No, I think that a lot of those people, as we as the military would call the enemy, don't care any second about that. For them, it's also their rationale to especially concentrate on doing harm on civilian aid workers and things like that, because it's part of their communication strategy. They need this worldwide look on the things they are doing for certain reasons, for realistic reasons, for earning more money, and things like that. So we as the military are aware, we see it like that, and we are aware of that. Do we want to fulfill the things some people call a humanitarian, not a humanitarian space, it's the other way around. If the humanitarians are not there, do we want to fulfill a humanitarian gap? Yes, thanks. We really don't want to, but it's sometimes in our mandate. And then we try just to reflect in the situation, how should we do it? Should we answer it by a military logic, or should we answer it by a civilian or so-called humanitarian logic? And this makes it very, very difficult how to answer it in this moment if you have the mandate to do something that is not typical military, which could be humanitarian assistance. If it's time of armed conflict. I mean, this is not the problem in catastrophic situations and things like that, but in an armed conflict, which is most of the time the case, this is very complex. Do we have international principles for this? We had Oslo guidelines, MCDA, things like that, but I think they do not fit into the time frame we now have. I think they should be overlooked and written down some more details on how to behave. What are we trying to do, for example, to avoid, too close interaction, but fulfilling our mandate? Okay, let me give you an example, the example of protecting someone in an area when it is in our mandate. Then we try to do something what we call, which is very difficult, we try to do something that we call aerial security, meaning we provide a safe and secure environment by not being seen directly with the humanitarian aid workers. But what is the prerequisite of that? The prerequisite of that is, let us talk before much more than we ever did. So everybody knows who's moving where, when, things like that, so we cannot, unintentionally be seen together, even if we don't want. So, and I think this is enough as a first statement.
Maybe let me just also ask a question and expand on this. For instance, let's say we didn't talk a lot about the humanitarian intervention as such. Okay. But the humanitarian intervention, first of all, Bertrand said it, that sometimes this term can be abused. And also I think that maybe the strategic rationale might change because, okay, well, if let's say I have an insurgent group and I know that if I provoke enough violence from the opposites, from let's say the government side, the opposing side, there will be an outcry, there will be a so-called humanitarian intervention. I can therefore drag the international community into this conflict and therefore doing my bidding in a way. I'm not saying that, I'm not naming names, but that has happened in the past, right? So how do we deal with that? Because in this case, not the aid workers in the first line, but in the first line, the militaries suddenly step into a conflict that actually they have been dragged into or can be dragged into if this principle, if the strategists on these for let's say guerrilla armies or whoever finds out, okay, this is a nice way that other people do the fighting for us, or at least our force multipliers on our side.
Okay, I try to answer that. It's very difficult, and I try to answer it on one of the examples I know. most of the time with these new mandates from the United Security Council resolution, the intervening forces of the international community have a mandate that is clearly, most of the time, against one or some insurgent groups, however you want to call it, and on the side of the government. And when we assess that, we as the military would say the government is also part of the problem of the military conflict. And that, as it is changing, nobody sees the military in the most of the time of the UN missions anymore as impartial or as neutral as it was until the 1980s or something like that. Most of the mandates are not impartial or neutral. They are clearly on the side, especially on governments. Taking, for example, I hope I do not jump on somebody's feet when I say this now, but I hope it's my personal view. It's not the view of the Ministry of Defense from Austria. If you look, for example, on the mandate given in Congo, DRC Congo, you're clearly on the side of a government that I, as a private person, would not call democratic or however. Yeah?
I don't think anybody would.
And it's difficult to be on this side, of course. So you have to think how to follow your mandate, but on the other side, not killing everybody of M23, because sometimes you can convince M23. You can say to them, hey, come on, guys, it's not now, how to say, a Senegalese infantry battalion you have on the other side. It's now English Special Forces, and it's better not getting in touch with them. Stay on the other side, stay in Rwanda or wherever, yeah? Be outside of my area, for example. You can also talk to them. You can try to convince them, however, by force or just by good arguments, yeah? So you have on the operational side, if the politicians and the diplomats were not as stupid as most of the time, sorry, this is my personal belief, try to write too much in the detail of the mandate, how you should do it. You, as a military, can, how to say, use broader instruments within the toolbox. I always give this example of the hammer is one part of the toolbox the military has following a political mandate. But everybody who has already, in the past had the task to put a painting or a photograph on the wall, yeah, by using the hammer and the nail, he knows he can do it in different ways. Yeah? And he can do it in the way that he do not hit his own finger. He does not hit the finger of the person holding the nail, which could, for example, be the humanitarian aid workers. And he could do it in a way like not dropping the hammer because he's hitting too hard or using the wrong hammer or using the wrong nail or whatever. And then the hammer drops down, and as most of you know, it's most of the time the small children standing and watching what the father is doing with the hammer and things like that. Yeah? So you can use the hammer and the nail in a proper way, and you can use it in a stupid way. And what we try most of the time to do is we try to use it in a clever way.
Suzanna, I think you want to respond. But let me also ask you, for instance, let's stay with this question. In the case of the areas that we've been working on recently in the Syrian, Iraqi, Middle East arena, if I would cry for, hey, yeah, we need a humanitarian intervention, what would you think? Is that a good idea? Is it a bad idea?
As a humanitarian, I will always say we need to look for a diplomatic and political solution, not necessarily military boots on the ground, as they say, might be the solution. However, it's very good because you're reading my mind. I wanted just to give the example of Iraq. I mean, a few months ago, it's last year in September, you remember that Iraq was going as a crisis which was slightly under the radar. Nobody really was paying a lot of attention until the Yazidi, 40,000 Yazidi, all of a sudden found themselves stranded on Mount Sinjar, with ISIS, surrounding them and at risk of, there was the massive outcry. There is going to be a genocide. It's an ethnic cleansing. They are going to be killed. Who intervened actually was the military. The first unfortunate attempt of airdrops, so bringing. I mean, you know what is Mount Sinjar? Mount Sinjar is a big mountain. It's a rock. There are no trees, there's no water. People were staying without water on temperatures which were reaching the 50 degrees Celsius, mainly women and children. So this is the Mount Sinjar situation for several days. So first intervention failed, unfortunately. It was the attempt of launching water and some food supplies by the Iraqi army. Because, as you know, the situation, you have the Peshmerga in northern Iraq, Baghdad-related Iraqi army, etc. It was actually, without, I would say, any mandate, but mainly on humanitarian ground, that you found then without, again, just entering or invading, how do you call it, the air space?
Yes.
The airspace, you had Turkish military coming and dropping humanitarian assistance. You had then the British. And everybody, it was interesting because you know, we had this conversation within the humanitarian country team in Erbil when we were discussing, I mean, what it is. But we said that those people need to be saved. I mean, everything has to be done in order to take 40,000 people, mainly women and children, civilians, out of this mountain to the first safe place where they can receive, you know, basic assistance and everything. And actually, it was on the request of the population within, you know, the different countries, that the government found themselves compelled that they have to do something. I mean, obviously, now mounting a military operation, it was impossible, but they said, okay, at least, you know, we can provide some humanitarian assistance. So here, I mean, what can I say? I said I can only welcome it because it was on a purely humanitarian ground. You didn't have any military operation. It was launched and come back. So this is an example also where I would say we can maybe use as a positive example of civilian-military cooperation as well. And then, as my colleague was saying, it's much easier, you know, engaging with the military in situation of natural disasters. It's not neither sensitive, neither you take sides. It's just that you use, I mean, there's nobody that has the logistic capacities than the military in terms of reaching out and distributing. And you can see it, you know, in Haiti at the beginning or the Philippines as well.
And thanks, Suzanna. Sabine, also, I'm not a Quaker, by the way, again. But let me stick with these moral questions. And one that also I remember, I think MSF was tackling was, remember after the genocide in Rwanda, of course, you had this huge influx of refugees into Congo. And then, after some while, the international community found out, okay, well, basically, these are the murderers or their families, right? So you have these moral questions all the time involved. As you said, Bertrand, as you said, Suzanna, so how to deal with that? I mean, is it on us to decide who is good and evil, or how do we tackle these problems? That you have to help everyone. I mean, isn't that especially if in your line of work, that's the case, right?
Yeah, I think it's important to point to the Rwanda example, because for me there are two outstanding examples where we can see a negative impact of aid. In a bigger context, we must not forget that when we talk about Rwanda, there was first of all a big failure in international politics to prevent this genocide from the beginning. But when we are looking at the situation after, indeed, the genocidaires were rearming in the camps, and they were indeed fed by humanitarian assistance. There was a lot of diversion of resources. There was a lot of legitimacy given. I think it's the worst case study ever. And for MSF, we left the camps actually speaking out also about what was happening there. And that's, I think, also an important aspect for us to always be able to actually speak on behalf of the people on what's actually happening. And by the way, this is an additional added value of who else is there, if not international humanitarian aid workers, to actually point to what the situation is. But nevertheless, I think it is one of the worst cases, and they did receive a lot of support from humanitarian action. That's one. The other difficult one for me is Somalia, where, again, we've seen a lot of diversion of aid, and particularly where, with this business of security, I mean, Somalia is one of the few examples where I think almost no international humanitarian actor can work without armed escorts. So it has become a huge industry, and we can very directly see how this is basically sustaining the economy in the country and the economy of the different fractions and whatever. Still, it's only last year that MSF decided to pull out of Somalia because of those difficulties, because also of the worsening security situations. And I can say I think it's one of the most painful decisions that the organization ever had to take, to know that there is a country with tremendous humanitarian needs, and we are not able to be there. And we also know it's only a question of time until the next nutrition crisis that will be forced to find another way in. So it really is one of the big dilemmas. I'd also want to say a word on the military humanitarian cooperation. It is a really tricky one, and I'm glad you pointed to the importance of having clear roles and mandates. I think we've all understood that, and we're working on that. It is much easier in natural disasters, obviously. I think the really important point is that military actors, whoever they are, and you've pointed to that, they are always perceived in a political light. And that's what we want to avoid, and that's why we are very keen on being seen distinctly and not in an association with them.
So now it's payback time for Bertrand, because he raised too many questions. Now you're raising a lot of questions. Let me add my own as well. And okay, let's pick Libya, right? That was a humanitarian intervention. There was a Security Council resolutions. Of course, the Russians and Chinese now say that was overstepped, but let's not touch on that. That's not our topic here. And then, if I look at Libya today, it didn't really give humanitarian intervention a great name. At least, let me say that as a journalist. That's also my personal opinion here. And how to deal with that? What do we do with humanitarian intervention? And then, what's next? You know?
I'm not convinced that it was, in any meaningful sense, a humanitarian intervention. It was a political intervention against a dictator whom the French and the British had very good reasons to hate, and the Americans too, and a very unpleasant dictator who had been constantly been irksome to the system. To describe it as a humanitarian intervention is to stretch the definition of humanitarian in a radical different way. I mean, which of the humanitarian principles were actually applied in the Libyan intervention? So this is where I'm not very comfortable with some of the seepage between, and I'm sure my colleagues in the humanitarian sector are feeling a little bit queasy about this definition of, is it a humanitarian intervention in Libya? The media called it that, the politicians call it that, and some of the military call it that. Now, this is where I take a little, when Günther Barnet pointed out that the military are not necessarily very comfortable with the humanitarian label. Well, it depends where you are, but in the United Kingdom, where there are adverts recruiting soldiers, where there is a very strong humanitarian content to the jobs of the military in the advert. It's obviously used for recruitment purposes, and I think it's an easier message to sell to an idealistic 18-year-old than to actually say maybe you will suffer from PTSD from all the things you've actually experienced in the field. So I think we have to be honest about this. The military are sometimes playing the humanitarian card for various PR purposes or indeed recruitment purposes. And I think the Libyan, as far as I'm concerned, the Libyan story, there were a lot of humanitarians involved in Libya doing great work, but I don't think that the military expedition in Libya can in any meaningful way be described as a humanitarian intervention. I don't actually believe, I think it's a contradiction in terms, fundamentally.
You want to respond to that?
Yes. Let me just write down something. First thing, it wasn't a humanitarian intervention, even if someone says it was, because comparing it with Rwanda or something like that, I cannot see, ethnic cleansing or massive violence against the whole unity of civilian people in Libya or something like that. I think it was a political fought war with a so-called protection of civilian mandate, which is a mess for me personally, as I'm in favor of protection of civilian, which is my idealistic point of why I became a soldier. But it was a war that wasn't fought out until a victory. There was no stabilization afterwards. It has the problem with the Arabs saying, please, no non-Arabic boots on the ground, which is always a problem in the Arab countries. And it's, Arabic neighbors still, or regional Arabic powers, like in the Gulf, pickling around in this conflict. So how can you manage that by before bombing some areas? I mean, nobody ever could think that he can win a war without boots on the ground and without stabilization afterwards and without transformation of the political system and without, transformation of the socio-economic situation in the distribute of wealth within the communities and all these things like that. Whoever thought that would be an idiot. But the reason why it was done like that was, it was, the following of Afghanistan and politicians saying we don't want stabilization missions anymore with more than 10, 20, 30, 100,000 troops there for more than 3 months, up to 10 years or longer. Nobody wanted that politically. If you would ask me, a political plan for this, or no, excuse me, a military plan for this would always look other than the things that were chosen by politicians and diplomats. This is most of the time the case.
I agree. But before I go over to Suzanna, one quick one. When I listen to you guys talking here, I have the feeling that maybe our toolbox is not big enough. That we hear from Günther, that of course there's a military toolbox. We hear from the two of you, there is a humanitarian toolbox. But of course, there's a political toolbox that's there, but there seems to be elements missing, isn't there? That you don't fill, that the military can fill, and obviously the politics operating in a vacuum here. So I don't know, Bertrand, you have an answer to that, or?
I don't have an answer. I'm only an observer, like all of us in this room, and and when I look at the past, I don't find any answers that are specific to that. I do think it's urgent and important to remind ourselves of the hubristic nature of the humanitarian project. We try to fix a lot of problems with a very little amount of money. You are really dealing with, on the scale of the global economy, minuscule sums. So let's not, I'm slightly irritated when I go to a meeting and I hear somebody from the UN telling us that we've never had it so good, that money is flowing, and that we're still talking nonsense. It's absolutely minuscule. So let's be realistic. You know, if you want to patch a massive wound with a tiny piece of plaster or a tiny piece of fabric, you've got to be realistic. The hemorrhage is going to carry on because there's no way you're going to fix it like that. So I think if you want to fix humanitarian problems, you've got to spend a heck of a lot more. But you don't want to, so there you go.
Suzanna, are you dealing with, when you were operating in the area in the Middle East where you were, we still are, for instance, one of the moral issues is, let's say you run a refugee camp near the border of Syria, and you find out, okay, well, this, of course, it's a refugee camp, but sometimes men, they use it as kind of a recreation ground, you know, to get, you know, their breath back, and then go back into the conflict arena. And we know that's happening. That's not, I'm not making this up. And you have these moral questions constantly. Again, going back to our topic, whether humanitarian aid actually prolongs war, how do you deal with these questions? Of course, and I'm talking about the little issues here, that for instance, how do I prevent people who came to my refugee camp then to go out again? How do I make sure that, as you said with Mount Sinjar, that was clear cut, right? Because there were people basically in battle in this stretch of mountain. If we don't rescue them, they will die from thirst, or will be get shot and killed. But in other areas, it's not so clear cut, because then for instance, you bring flour in, you bring water in, etc. You bring medical equipment in, and then again it diffuses to whoever is there who might need it, and that might be competence also. So these questions, how can we deal with them in a meaningful way?
You have asked at least 15 questions in this one. But as you know very well from your also own experience as a journalist, when you enter into a camp, and particularly if you enter, you know, at the beginning, at a certain time, you know, in a camp, you will always, and you want to have interviews and focus group discussion and everything. One of the first striking things is, where are the men? I mean, usually, in a camp, 80% of the population are women and children. Men stay behind. Men, if you ask also a question, if you have, you know, if you succeed in creating a sufficiently open and safe situation, and if you ask, you know, women, where is your husband? The answer is, he's staying back home, he protects the house. She's certainly, I mean, the answer is not going to be he's there back fighting, you know, for whichever, you know, position they have. You know also that, I mean, somebody was talking today, I think in the panel before ours, you know, we talk about Jordan, we talk about Lebanon and everything. It's not that easy to cross this border anymore. I mean, it's not just us within, it's difficult for men to fluctuate, you know, and come in and out and so say, oh, they're coming now here to get assistance and then they go back. It is increasingly more difficult, and it has been always. I mean, it's, you know, states are not stupid. Those border controls, they, you know, they control. So the big number of combatants stay on the other side. It's difficult for them to come in. You always will have, I mean, one of the things it is, you were talking about also infiltration of terrorist elements, or you will see, I mean, in a camp, people do not talk that openly. Usually they whisper. And I mean, after you finish, you know, a conversation, somebody will come and then will tell you what they really believe, because they're afraid of many things. I mean, they might be afraid, you know, in Jordan about that agents of the Syrian states are there, and then they will be, you know, once they come back, they will be persecuted because they don't believe, for example, that Assad regime will fall, or even if it does, they will be still at risk. So it is very interesting because you always have it. I mean, this is a situation that we all deal with. But then when you look at, here we take, you know, the mandate. Again, we are there to protect and provide basic life-saving services to people that found themselves in a situation of extreme vulnerability, and it is also almost, it's, you know, it's the law of numbers. I mean, the majority of people are actually civilians; they are not combatants.
But Suzanna, you're absolutely right. We had the case recently in Lebanon. You were referring to that, I guess, while basically the government was pushing the NGOs to scale back the assistance so that people would leave. You're absolutely right. That's the reality. And again, I'm wondering, going back to my toolbox question, isn't also your dilemma here as the humanitarians sitting on this panel, that basically you would need to do political work, much more political work than you can do, because maybe openly, right? Because again, as soon as you get political, MSF, Caritas, CARE, whoever, you can't be operational, you can't work, because who's, you know, what about your neutrality? You get up in maybe sometimes a little bit dirty debates and so on that you don't want to be caught in. But still, I'm asking you, you know, first of all, is that correct? Is that a problem? That you need to be more political to tackle, for instance, these issues? Or if not, if you're doing sometimes a sense that maybe you're doing it, but of course so that people like myself, like journalists, we don't figure out really.
Yeah, I would say, I would change actually. You are using the word political. I will change it into what we do, it's advocacy. What we do is behind the scenes lobbying and making sure that rarely you will see, you know, that one organization comes up front, you know, and announce a specific situation. If we know that the regimes within which we operate, the first thing that they are going to do is to kick us out. So obviously, again, it is you have to balance, and it is a very, very difficult balance. You know, should they announce? Should they not? Today, if you look in the sphere, and we do, all of us. I mean, there is not one organization who doesn't do, you know, advocacy, have very strong, and usually a part also of networks. We do influence in meetings with our politicians, decision makers at UN levels and everything, the situation and the needs for it. But, yeah.
But things have changed, because 20, 30 years ago, you could denounce a regime and simultaneously work with it, because it was very unlikely that a dictator in some remote area was going to read your campaigning material in London or Paris. Absolutely. Now, unfortunately, the world is much smaller from that point of view. They can actually check in real time everything you say. And that really is and they do.
And they do. I mean, everything that I say, even maybe this humanitarian forum, if it goes on YouTube or somewhere else, is going to be heard. And it might be used, you know, against, well, nothing that what we said here is of this level, but definitely this is something that we need, that this is the new normal. I mean, we need to adjust ourselves and the way that we operate as well.
But does it mean that you're going to censor yourself?
Sorry?
Does it mean you have to exercise self-censorship? That you can no longer speak out? when you witness things that you deem are unacceptable?
I never said this. I said that there are ways and ways that you can do it, and you have to balance, what it is in this moment the most important. I will be able to denounce it, but I have also to be sure, that I reach and I am able to provide and assist millions of people with my humanitarian assistance. So it is a balance, and I think we do both.
I think we can take questions.
Sure, that's great. So I think maybe if the audience want to weigh in at this point and ask questions, we'd be very happy to. Yeah.
Did not harm me.
Back there.
On one of the hands.
Hello. Hello, my name is Mark Kudlik. I'm affiliated with Der Standard for today, but right now my job is completely done, so I'm speaking for myself. And I would like to bring into this discussion the issue of private military contractors, because there are legitimate guesses, because there is not that much certain information about it. But in the Afghan war, there are maybe as much private military contractors on the ground as official forces, and these forces are there to protect UN affiliates or maybe even humanitarian aid workers. So I would pose the question, is this not also pose a threat to insurgents or to different groups which could legitimately their war against the government or something like that, in the sense of an imperialistic discourse or something like that? Thank you.
That was, I think, a very good intervention from your side. Thank you for that. The question was, private military contractors, Blackwater and others, we have already talked, the water is already murky, and now we have another player that makes it even more muddy. I mean, what are we going to do about it? Who wants to pick it up? Yeah, Sabine?
I can try to talk about that. It's a very difficult one. We try to avoid them wherever possible, and I think at this point we can look at the security paradigm also, because that's a big difference between those, I think also between many armies and obviously private military contractors, that their belief is they can guarantee security by armed protection. We don't believe in that. The experience has shown that what gives us security really is the acceptance, the trust of the population. And the population and all the stakeholders in a conflict. And that's what we are really committed to work on: negotiation, gaining acceptance, as my colleague said earlier, by also showing that what we are doing is relevant. And it's not only relevant to some civilians. All those combatants have families back home who also need healthcare in our case, or any other basic services. So that's what we believe in and what we will continue to believe in, and in that way avoid to have any need for private security firms. But they are a reality, and they are messing up the scene even more as it is.
They've been messing up the scene for a long time. I mean, you can go back to the Biafra War, etc. There's been mercenaries for as long as there's been wars. But you're right, the scale of... I think the key issue is security. What is security? And if security means bunkerizing the humanitarian system behind high walls, guards, machine guns, and that sort of behavior, then that's the illusion of security. But from the point of view of an HR manager, somebody who's a long way off, who's worried about their workers, paying for a contractor who might provide some kind of, protection, at least on paper, is very tempting. It's very tempting, because to be reliant on well-understood self-interest, to be reliant on basically rational processes of self-interest. Well, that doesn't always work, because sometimes people do things for other reasons than their self-interest, and they may have a different strategic perspective. They may be, so hence people kidnapping, people who are there to help them, you know, because in the longer run, in a different political game, it makes some sense to them as well.
I cannot agree more with my colleague from MSF. The way that we use the security systems that we have, it's acceptance, it's protection by acceptance. So we need to build a relationship with the communities that we serve and prove, you know, that we are actually providing a useful service, that we are neutral, that we are impartial. So even more important, you know, to stick really to the core humanitarian principles as well. That's one thing. Second thing, I mean, just speaking about values, I mean, I can tell you that there is no one NGO who will ever receive, you know, money from a donor to pay for a private service contractor a la Blackwater. I mean, this would be, you know, an entire hour budget in terms of just for the protection. I mean, Blackwater or any other. I mean, this is not. I mean, in the majority of cases, also, if you're the type of private companies that you were talking, security companies, they were actually engaged by private contractors, who it's a completely different agent than humanitarian workers, etc.
And Günther, it also poses a problem for regular armies, doesn't it? Because, because in the conflict arena, people maybe cannot differentiate. The guys in the black uniforms are private, and the other ones are legitimate government soldiers, right?
Thomas, you're completely right. I try to answer that on two levels, on the strategic and on the operational tactical. The first is on the strategic level. I'm a follower of the Westphalian state idea. If the state gives up to provide security, or the international community, if a failing state happens or something like that, then he has done wrong. And liberal states who are using already private security companies, for example, like US did a lot of time, I mean, they give up to be liberal, yeah? Because it's, as we in German say, it's the Gewaltmonopol of the state. Yeah? It's not the right. They're trying, but there are two reasons for it. The first is they are trying to hide the budget. Yeah. Just very simple, they're trying to hide the budgets. And the second thing is, then it's not soldiers from this country dying. Yeah? And as in this post-heroic society, the world cannot live with the fact that soldiers are dying, which is just normal. You know it. When you become a soldier, you know, maybe I will die. When you become a policeman, you know, maybe I will die. That's how it is. You must decide that before you get into the organization. And a state who gives up this idea, who thinks that soldiers will not die in war, okay, this is not a state anymore. But on a tactical level, they are a real mess. They are a real mess for us because there's no distinction, really. You cannot obviously see who is who. The second thing is most of them have been regular soldiers before, and there are a lot of reasons why they left the army, and we know these reasons, and this is one of the factors why we don't like them also. And for me, there's nothing more than an accountable force. In a crisis situation like that, where everything is very, very complex, and you need a security provider, he should be accountable. And these people are not accountable by their organizational structures at all and by their personal beliefs most of the time. I would make just a small distinction between them and security advisors. There are a lot of former military people or policemen working also for the humanitarian organizations as security advisors, but none of them should ever be weaponed. And I know it's a strict rule not to be weaponed. And they are just, how to say, they're doing assessments for them. They're telling them about the security situation. They try to speak with the regular forces from whoever to get situations where the humanitarian work then can trustfully be done. And I would make a strict distinction between them and these Blackwater people and like that.
Understood. Okay, we have more questions. Okay. Thanks. Yes, please. Wait for the microphone. Hold on, just one. Thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to comment a bit on the negative image of the term politics on this panel. I mean, politics is what we learned from the ancient Greeks, what concerns us all, or what Hannah Arendt said, it's acting in concert, and she herself quoted Edmund Burke. So actually it's regulating the public interest. So on the national level as well as on the international level, humanitarian, military interventions are of course political, and they have to be. And because they are under, when they are not unilateral, as in the case of the Kosovo, they are under a Chapter 7 mandate, which is given by the Security Council under international law, and at the same time, the Security Council is a political organ. Whether it needs to be improved or not is another discussion. But anyway, the resolution 1973 on Libya was actually the responsibility to protect in action. That's the best we have ever got so far. And also the mandate on the Congo from March 2013, I think it was 2168, with the offensive operations and occasionally to support the government, was actually against perpetrators, against the M23. So there was a clear division between those who are breaching the peace and those who are not able to, well, exert the monopoly of violence because they are not willing to have it, or they don't have it, they are not strong enough. This is the case of the Congolese army, so you may choose what side you will take. But anyway, the resolution 1973 was the responsibility to protect, and it's not against ethnic cleansing, it's also, and this was the main cause for it, the criteria of the ICC, the 4 criteria we have in the World Summit meeting enshrined in 2005, of course, a vaporized responsibility to protect. But crimes of war and crimes against humanities, these were the reasons given for the resolution 1973. So I come back to my initial question, what is so bad about being political? And as far as I understood Bernard Kouchner, when he separated from the International Red Cross, it was about political issues because they did not share the strict neutrality of the International Red Cross, which applied to the old wars where there was no judge who is right in Solferino, whether the French or whether the other parties. So, but now we have a clear division. The UN is a peace order, and there is actually a duty to keep the peace.
Sabine.
I think there's something that maybe came across wrongly, because I completely agree with you about the importance of those resolutions and about the importance of humanitarian, of political action. I think that's what many of us were calling for, actually more political engagement in situations of armed conflict. Just to take a position from the view of a private international humanitarian actor, we understand that it's highly political, and we are very committed and working on understanding the political dimensions, but we also clearly want to be separated from any political interests. And that's why we do not engage in peace work, for example, and we are against or very critical towards a coherence agenda, because we strongly believe even peace work, as much as it's needed, is highly political. It always divides people and positions, and we strive to maintain also a political independence. In terms of the neutrality, thank you for pointing that out. Yes, we do make compromises to the initial definition of neutrality as it's understood and believed by the Red Cross, in the sense that MSF says we are also speaking out, and that we are very aware that by speaking about what's happening on the ground, we may compromise on neutrality, but we always try and aim to talk about what we've seen, especially in terms of the medical consequences, and not commenting on political responsibilities.
I personally think that there's a danger. I think there are tools of the international community, and they're all valid tools in their own rights. However, getting them confused is profoundly dangerous. for the humanitarian actors themselves, and I'm concerned. So the ICC, the International Criminal Court, great, except when people perceive the humanitarians to be informers to the ICC. That's dangerous. That creates a risk that's unnecessary. A responsibility to protect is a great tool because it is a way of going beyond the Westphalian rule or at least reactualizing the Westphalian system. And that's, again, legitimate and right. Is it humanitarian? I don't think it is. Now, my point is that my understanding of humanitarian aid is very restrictive. It is about trying to save some lives in a particular context. And I think if you extend the concept of humanitarian to basically military intervention or judicial intervention, I think you're stretching a pretty simple tool, the hammer maybe, a simple tool to try to do all sorts of things. And I personally own a Swiss Army knife, and I think it's actually good for nothing.
Okay.
Most of the time when you try to open a wine bottle with it, you break.
Nothing works.
Yeah, you're right.
Please.
I would like,
sure,
if it's possible. I was a student, I have to be careful. I'm in favor. I'm in favor of both concepts: responsibility to protect and protection of civilians on different levels and in different questions. But the problem is, if we really follow R2P, then the question is: can we overcome every dictator and regime in the world? Are we willing to? Politically, not, because sometimes we like to work with them for different reasons. Have we enough forces to overcome all of them? No, we haven't. So if we use R2P in the context of something we do politically, that might be okay, but if you have other reasons behind, and this was for me because I used the argument in the case of Libya, I think there were a lot of other reasons than R2P for doing this intervention, then the instrument itself loses the legitimacy, and secondly, the politics lose the legitimacy. And what I have, my problem is I was half my professional life military officer and half-life a politician. I know both sides. And the problem is military officers, most of the time, and this is also historically, have to think what happens afterwards because they stay most of the time in the army. Politicians do not for all that, in all that cases. So they are not responsible for what they are deciding in the next 10 years. And a younger officer who decides badly in a situation will never become general in the most westernized armies. Yeah? And nowadays we don't have generals who try to, to convince politicians this is a bad plan because they're all yes-sayers. And in the older times it was other, and you will find more generals leaving their posts because they say this is a bad plan. Taking, for example, the Canadian general in Rwanda and reading his book and what he said at the time. So this is why I make the distinction between responsibility, and this is just my personal view. And on the operational level, protection of civilians is possible. On the strategic level, R2P, a very difficult concept, even if I'm in favor of it.
Okay, do we have more interventions, questions? Yes, I see a hand going up back there.
Yeah, my name is Taithe from MSF as well. And I really would like to thank this panel today. It's not a question, it's more a comment. I really like to thank you because you teach us a good lesson of humanitarian realism, actually. And because you mentioned, there is a realist and an idealist in each soldier. I think the same is true also for humanitarian workers. Well, does humanitarian aid prolong war? I think we've got an answer, yes, in some way it does. I would even go a step further and would say, despite all good intentions of humanitarian aid in conflict sometimes even is a dirty business because it's stained by compromises, and we've heard some examples. So that's more the realistic part, which we face every day in everyday's work on the ground. But something which has not been mentioned, and that might be more on the idealistic side, is what humanitarian aid also delivers, a part of the survival of the most vulnerable, is that it restores dignity. And I think this is just as much as important, that in a situation where everything falls apart in a country, that as a humanitarian organization you are able to restore dignity for the population.
Thank you. Who wants to comment? No?
I'm sorry. I didn't understand what you said. I couldn't hear you.
Okay. You want to comment?
Well, I mean, thank you very much for thanking us. So there you go. I think it's a good way to end the day. So we're all pleased with ourselves. That's great. But I really think that this humility at the heart of the humanitarian work is actually very difficult to stick to, and it's very admirable when people manage to avoid this mission creep, this idea that everything can be solved, and they stick to their job, and their job is not easy, and it's very challenging.
Just my last question maybe for my panel. Going back to the Does Humanitarian Aid Prolong War? Isn't also one of the problems that we have talked about humanitarian intervention and maybe the abuses of that term, then remember that aid convoy going to eastern Ukraine and the propaganda that went with it. And I was also asking myself, okay, this is a humanitarian, humanitarian act of the Russian Federation sending this convoy to eastern Ukraine. And then you ask yourself, okay, isn't it, I mean, people might become cynical, you know what I mean? You mentioned, why don't we all, some people might think, why don't we all just put the whole Middle East under glass and let them kill each other, and then they should all just leave us in peace, right? I mean, you didn't say that, but we all know that people, you didn't say that people were saying that, but I said it, but we all know that this is, with some people, that's exactly what they are thinking. And the same thing is, isn't cynicism a problem? That, that this question that is here, actually, again, I'm innocent, I didn't put it on the program, but I think it's a very important question. And isn't that what's going on? That sometimes cynicism is what keeps, maybe, or what makes your work as humanitarians, maybe even sometimes that of the military, because I'm not saying that it's always the bad intentions that I think, saw in Iraq, but sometimes it's, I mean, can we allow, a dictator to kill the people of Benghazi? I mean, it's a legitimate thing to say, well, we don't know what's to do next, but let's not let it happen, even if we maybe agree that it wasn't that exactly. But what about cynicism in how can we fight that? Because that's what brings the question to the fore.
Well, I think looking at this debate, we've talked a lot about what has gone wrong and what can go wrong, but we could take a moment to look at what has gone right. And in all modesty, there's a lot to be proud of, I believe. I mean, just thinking of Darfur in all its complexity, we all know that the humanitarian disaster would have been very different if we didn't find ways to access, and we did. Central African Republic, just the same. And again, I recall a statement said earlier that humanitarian staff there actually could see that it made a difference when they were there. Literally, the presence of international actors does minimize the disastrous effects of violence. So, I mean, there are so many reasons for us to continue and to learn. And I think that has been, that reflection is contributing to our learning and to get better with the little means that we have.
Yeah, I agree. I would say just thankfully and gratefully, the number of people that still believe that we have to do something is a majority compared to the cynics. And so people that want to engage, want to be sure, that we do bring the necessary assistance, that we do save lives, are still there. I mean, it's encouraging. And I know it's easy to enter into rhetorics, that's the easiest thing. And also it's much easier to criticize than to be constructive. This is just human. So I would say we are doing our best. More can be done, definitely, and better can always be done. But I think we need to also sometimes just stop and be, realistic and celebrate also those achievements that we have.
Every year, my students tell me around Christmas, everything you're telling us is ruining my utopian ideals. Why are you turning us into cynics? And every year I tell them, you're cynic by Christmas, but you're going to be an intelligent utopian by June. And I think it's important that it is about learning, and it is about learning. And it isn't as if the humanitarians are not learning. They are working very hard on learning. I think there's ways to go. But I think, so I'm not a cynic. I never was, never will be. And I am full of profound admiration for the people who are engaged in the humanitarian sector. I am not a humanitarian in the sense that I'm an academic, but it doesn't stop me from having that admiration for my colleagues in the humanitarian system.
Thomas, to give you, how to say, a true answer on that, what I personally think is, in the military, when you have these very, very complex and critical situations where you can easily get cynic, we normally have two things. Get drunk when it's possible and make bad jokes of ourselves and maybe of our best comrade. In this modern and political correct systems, both things are not allowed anymore in the army, and this is one of the reasons why some of us behave wrong nowadays. And I mean this, and I mean this truly.
There are sometimes allowed in the contractor sector.
I'm sure that humanitarians also have bad jokes and sometimes might drink a beer or two. And by the way, this is actually a wonderful line that you gave me, because that's what we're going to be doing soon. Because I want to end this panel here. Thank my wonderful panelists for the lively debate. Thanks a lot. And that's the end of this. And enjoy the dinner. And
thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. It was very good.